We've previously covered the Soviet campaign in Finnmark, the northeastern part of Norway, to drive out German garrisons during the final months of the Second World War, an instance where the Soviets actually kept their word, restoring the pre-war Norwegian monarchy and then withdrawing a few months later after Germany's surrender, as opposed to setting up a communist government in the region like they did in many other places. But there was another Nordic region that shared a similar fate, at first uneasy about Soviet intentions, then relieved upon a goodwill gesture by Moscow. The island of Bornholm is located in the middle of the western Baltic. Due to its centralized location, the island was traded between Baltic powers for centuries. From 1660, Bornholm has been part of the Danish crown. During the Second World War, Denmark was officially neutral. This remained the case even after Germany garrisoned the country. As we've discussed previously in relation to Greenland, this essentially allowed both sides in the war to use Danish territory as they saw fit, while the country's official neutrality allowed both sides to leave Denmark's political situation intact. As such, the Germans built up extensive fortifications and defenses on Bornholm. These included huge coastal defense batteries, although reportedly only one shot, a test, was ever fired. One notable incident occurred in 1942 when what appeared at the time to be a pilotless plane crash-landed on Bornholm. The island's Danish officer in charge, Lieutenant Commander Christensen, would photograph and sketch the wreckage before the Germans could get to it, secretly passing his findings to the British. This pilotless plane would turn out to be effectively a drone, the German V-1. The model, known as the Flying Bomb, was still in testing, and the Danish discovery would give the British a leg up in defending against it. As Germany's eastern front collapsed late in the war, Bornholm was increasingly in the crosshairs. In the final days of the war, the Germans were attempting to surrender all of their forces to the Western powers, while at the same time fighting against the Soviets and attempting to facilitate the evacuation of civilians along the Baltic from the eastern regions. A key component of this was Bornholm, which offered a commanding position in the central Baltic. The German garrison was roughly 12,000 strong. With the Soviets demanding that the island surrender, the German commander, Kamptz, attempted to buy more time. He attempted to contact the British representative in Copenhagen, requesting that the British send a token force to the island so the Germans could surrender to them. However, the British refused, and the Soviets were out of patience. They warned that a bombing campaign would commence, demanding that the Germans surrender to them, and dropping propaganda leaflets encouraging Danish civilians to evacuate the island's towns. Although the British, after consultation with General Eisenhower and the Americans, had refused to accept a separate surrender of Bornholm to the Western powers, they did nonetheless assert their right to accept an unconditional surrender of the island, while also attempting to discourage the Soviets from carrying out the planned bombing. Nonetheless, on May 7th, one of the final days before Germany's overall surrender, the promised Soviet airstrikes commenced. Thousands of buildings were destroyed or damaged, with multitudes of German troops killed, as well as 10 unfortunate civilians. Copenhagen was already celebrating, and news of the bombings was not made public in Denmark for fear of spoiling the celebration that had been anticipated for 6 years. On May 9th, after Germany's overall surrender, the Soviets landed on the island and engaged in a firefight. Now, however, the German garrison finally did capitulate to the Soviets. The next day, frontline troops were replaced by garrison forces, including several of the Red Army's units, which included female troops. Although administration was passed back to the now liberated Danish monarchy, the Soviets maintained their garrison on Bornholm pending future negotiations. The local populace was wary of the Soviets, especially given the horror stories about Red Army behavior in places like Berlin. However, relations between the Soviet troops and the locals in Bornholm was cordial. Hearing of these developments from Copenhagen, British Major General Richard Dewing said, quote, "This ended any chance that I might be called upon to put an oar into the whirlpool of Bornholm," but added that this was a good thing, as it meant the islanders would not be resentful toward the Americans and British for leaving them in the hands of the Soviets. The Soviets would requisition some supplies, such as wood and fuel, while in addition to rebuilding their own towns, the islanders were called upon to help construct new Soviet barracks. Despite occasional tensions, this working relationship between the islanders and the Soviets would continue. Meanwhile, discussions about the island's future were taking place. In July, the Danish Foreign Minister Møller proposed linking Soviet withdrawal from Bornholm with British withdrawal from mainland Denmark. However, upon discussions the next month with the new British Foreign Minister Bevan, he instead proposed linking it with British withdrawal from the Danish overseas territory of the Faroe Islands. The British were not keen on either possibility, as they did not want to tie their own security situation in northwest Europe to Soviet actions in the Baltic. In the end, Denmark's own attempts to arrange a deal regarding Bornholm would have to give way to negotiations between the victorious powers. A series of informal agreements were made regarding the Baltic. As part of this, Bornholm would remain part of the Kingdom of Denmark, while Soviet troops would withdraw in exchange for a prohibition on any foreign military bases on the island. Denmark itself, on the other hand, was required to station a garrison on Bornholm, even after Denmark became part of NATO, as the Soviets saw the presence of Danish troops to be far more palatable than a British or American garrison. With the agreement in place, the Soviets finally left the island April 5, 1946, their tumultuous entrance on the island having given way to largely cordial relations. Although the bombing and brief occupation of the island became largely forgotten, it certainly was remembered on the island itself, and the status quo that it helped forge in the Baltic would remain throughout the duration of the Cold War. Bornholm today is a quiet rural island, belying its much contested history, as well as its central place in geopolitical intrigues of the mid-20th century and the embryonic Cold War. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, make sure to hit the like button and leave a comment. For more content like this, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell button so you know when the next video is posted. Be sure to check out the project that forms the basis for these videos at apoliticalworldmap.org. And if you can, please donate on Patreon to keep the videos coming. Thanks again for watching. I'm Alex. I am out.